Connecting to the cloud server. Okay, so welcome. Welcome. My name is Dinsmore-Tuli, and I'm delighted this evening to be speaking with Yoli Joseph over there in Chicago. And we're speaking about intersectionality in action in specific relation to movements for social justice and healing, and in very particular connection to the Yoni Shakti, the movement. And we are currently in the midst of this campaign. I've been asked to make a little update to let you know that this movement to eradicate the abuse of women in yoga and to reclaim yoga as a tool for planetary healing and justice and freedom. That campaign, the crowdfunding campaign, has just got to 58%, which is awesome. It ends on the 5th of June, and we're really delighted to thank all the backers and the sharers. Keep doing the amazing job that you're doing. I'm deeply grateful to you. The whole team is grateful, and yeah, we're aiming for to reach that goal to launch a big public awareness campaign, and part of that awareness will come through intersectionality in action. Will it not, Yoli?
Yeah. Hey, Uma, why don't you throw that web address in there?
Yes, quick. I have to tell you where it's going. Otherwise, it's a Yoni Shakti, themovement.com. You got that? Yoni Shakti, themovement.com is where it's all happening, and we invite you to visit that space and share and maybe contribute if you feel to do that. We're really delighted to be moving this forward, and part of what we're doing is moving it forward with the amazing collaborative work. We're trying to model collaboration and international cooperation, and part of that is here speaking with Yoli, who is herself working at the intersection of Indigenous way, healing arts and yoga. She's an educator and a healer. Would you like to tell us your take on the practical implications of intersectionality for social justice movements? Yoli.
Yes. Thank you. So this is a fun continuation of when we had a chance to speak about the unique experiences of Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, people of the margins in yoga spaces, why the abuse that we experience is that and then some, and why it's so important to center the experiences of the most silenced voices, the most silenced experience, not because we're in it for some sort of marginalized people Olympics. Okay, so let's get this through our minds right away.
Okay.
This is not competitive, right? And so intersectionality is a very curious term. What I really want to get into today is how we get from terminology and theory into action. What does embodied intersectionality look like for us in the change that we would like to see in the world? And we know that, God, we would like to change pretty much every system that there is. Name one, it's probably outdated, right? Because they're all authored by the same limited imagination, and that the limitations of that imagination are in economic scarcity. They're in systems that divide and suppress: colonialism, imperialism, consumerism, capitalism, racism, classism, misogyny. They are harmful systems of oppression and shame. Intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 90s, a very important Black female scholar, is what she was pointing out was a dynamism.
Yeah.
That any one of us experience privilege and not privilege at the same time. And I did hit on this in our talk last week as well.
Yeah.
That I described that, my privilege of higher education is probably my highest privilege credential, right? And my privilege of being a woman, my privilege of being a woman of color, my privilege of being a non-mainstream religious, spiritual person, of, you know, being not married. Those things then will put me down in a hierarchy of privilege. And so what intersectionality is a systemized version. So when people claim that the system is working against them, that is not imagined. That is 100% true. The system is designed to the point that it is intergenerational.
Yeah.
Right? We are experiencing patterns of trauma today that we have inherited. They are resonating in our DNA. And for some of us, that can be a triggering thought, that can be a harrowing thought. But we also have to remember from that spiritual sense that our ancestors have our backs, past, present, and future. Like everywhere we have an obstacle, we also have leverage. We also have strength. So this is a conversation about upliftment.
Yeah.
This is a conversation about getting into action, but we have to continue to call out what social movements and activist movements of the past, distant and very recent, are still missing the mark on. Okay, so we're not claiming that we're going to get it perfect, but we're saying, hey, let's take the data that we have from these other movements and really look at, can we transform intersectionality into a state of dynamic being where we recognize that there is a paradigm of oppressor oppressed, right? So this is another way of looking at intersectionality in a verb or action form.
Yeah. And this is a helpful way to look at it, because otherwise it's just a theory.
Right.
And we can argue about how we define it until the cows come home, you know, and actually it won't be of any relevance in terms of the daily actions that we can take to make changes.
Well, it becomes an avoidance practice to doing the work. It becomes a deterrent. It becomes a problem. I'm seeing this in my own local community here, where there's this galvanized energy to do this unpack your privilege, anti-racism work. See, something important to really understand is you can't separate those two things, okay? So one of the features of white supremacy, of the construct of whiteness, and I want to talk a little bit more about that today, is that you may think that anti-racism work and unpack your privilege work are two different things. They're not. They are one challenging, ongoing, long-term doing that we all have to engage in, particularly white people, in order to equip yourself with the ability to actually see the injustices happening in real time. Okay, so what happens when we're learning is we will look at these events in retrospective. You literally won't be able to see it at the time, and you could be standing next to a person of color and they'll be like, did you just see that? Like, did you just see that I was spoken to completely differently than you were? Or more subtle, the references that I gave in our last talk, where you, white person, were given an advantage and I was handed a mop, you know, a broom, a dust bin to fill up with rubbish, you know, like, oh, here's your job, and here, no, you come into this inner circle and I'm going to elevate you through, you know, this system of abuse, and I'm going to make you feel like you're really good. But you, person of color, you already know your place, and that's in the subservient service role, right? Yeah. So when we're talking about these systems, then what are my ancestors, my future ancestors potentially, I say potentially because we're all about breaking chains in my household, you know, but my ancestors are then future ancestors are then potentially inheriting a framework of thinking that we should never strive for anything more than being a cleaner in service of others, right? Ooh, that brings us into like a little spiritual bypass, little loop there of like, remember I was talking about seva, the path of service and the path of meditation. When we talked about Tantra Gurukul, that's another little thing to get exploited, like, but you're serving others. Yeah. It's the path of seva, right? In all these little subtle ways that these demons of abuse and oppression find their way out and find their way into action. So kind of rewinding a few steps back, if we get stuck in theory, if we get stuck in semantics, which I'm seeing in my own community, what then we get stuck in is inaction. Yeah. And we literally don't know how to step forward. And this brings me back to yoga, meditation, wellness, hands-on healing as a practice, because it's doing, it's action, it's karma yoga. It's always meant to be a transformative practice experience. Yeah. And so we have to bring intersectionality into the conversation if we're going to liberate the liberation tool called yoga, because of intersectionality. Yeah. Right? Is that making any sense just yet, Uma?
It is, because what I see and is that actually what you're describing and calling for is that the action that's really needed is that we actually, it's a recognition of seeing what's going on. And sometimes that's actually, if people are completely imbricated in a system, then there actually isn't any way to see anything beyond that system. And you can't change that system. You can't change it with the same tools that built it. It's like you can't think your way out of a problem with the same mind that made the problem in the first place. And what I observe, especially in the commercial yoga world that I saw that you and I entered in parts of the United States, is like actually the very structures that allow those yoga corporations, those transnational and transactional yoga organizations to continue, are actually they're founded in systems of inequality in terms of who they employ to do what within those environments. And they also, in the way that teaching happens, you see basic setups of like complete disempowerment in the hierarchies of the way teachings are given, so that there's no possibility of questioning the existing power base and power structure. And within those structures, you can't make any changes. So I'm trying to be really specific here and thinking about what I see is that the abuses that happen, and there's lots of them. We talked about the unique experience of in commercial yoga studios and the abuses that have happened within some of the ashrams where women have been abused and raped and trafficked. And I'm looking at how each of those injustices, and I think that's a helpful word actually, because if we understand about injustice, you see that kind of harm happens because there is injustice in the very structures that are holding together. And we each have a unique way of understanding what's going on there. And that actually seeing how they join up and connect is completely crucial, because unless we do that, we're all still held in the same system and nobody can be free from it because we're all just.
So let's think about one of those nuances of the enablers.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So the people who know that the injustice is going on, and for whatever are their personal reasons, they want to protect themselves, they want to protect their own stances, they don't want to dismantle their own kind of guru programming, and then they become the silent, complicit enablers.
Yeah.
And we know that they're a spectrum of people who, might continue to feed that line of young women to that abusive guru, or turn an eye when it's only Black, brown, indigenous, people of color, or people of lower socioeconomic classes that are, you know, given these lowly jobs and never given opportunity to be in the representation space, right? So now we're talking about a very key component of anti-racism work, this embodied intersectionality, which is the paradigm of oppressor oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
That you can be both oppressed and oppress others at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the classic thing that you see with women serving the gurus who are actually in proximity to power. I call them the power-hungry handmaidens of the patriarchy. You know them? You know, the power-hungry handmaidens of the patriarchy will apologize and cover for the abuses of the gurus. Why? Because they're close up in their proximity to power. They believe that they acquire the power, but they don't. All they do then is pass on the oppression to the young girls that they're bringing. And so because they're actually still in that same system, and the people who are the beneficiaries, the ones who benefit from it, and the ones who just stand by, the bystanders, they're all dancing in this same complete delusion that the proximity you have to that power will free you. But all it does is give you the capacity to harm other people. And in doing so, so that's exactly what you're describing, the oppressor and the oppressed. And there's a term that I found incredibly helpful, which is like a kyriarchy. A kyriarchy is like a network of oppressive, intersecting damages and injustices that harm everybody in different degrees. Everybody ends up being harmed by this. We're all harmed by it because the system itself is fundamentally unjust.
And so now talking about kyriarchy and what I'm really introducing in, you know, in the talk that we gave last week, and this one really is about the vocabulary and the structure of anti-racism work, because I see how resistant people are to admitting that the work that needs to be done is actually an anti-racism work. It's like, oh, we're going to call it anything else except anti-racism. No, call it what it is, okay? So what is the kyriarchy? What is the overall structure that oppresses every single one of us? It is called whiteness. And whiteness is this intersectional, so we're describing, it's a dynamic, multidimensional structure that suppresses everyone under its pillars of colonialism, imperialism, the pseudoscience of social Darwinism, the economic insecurity of scarcity, this idea that there can never be enough. What nonsense, right? The ownership of ideas, you know, it's a little like, you know, some of you in comments before have referenced Orientalism. Yes, absolutely. Edward Said's work, then, you know, the post-colonial work of Frantz Fanon, of Foucault. These are the things that have inspired us academically up until now, where, yes, we're talking about a system that has been imposed on all of us. Yet, we don't want to initiate a marginalized Olympics on who's oppressed the most when we get into social action, because that's trickery of the kyriarchy, of the construct of whiteness itself, you know? And so the construct of whiteness is describing a white and a black, is describing a duality, is describing a haves and a have-nots. It's saying that, you know, this pyramidical structure of capitalism, it just simply has to be that there'll be people at the bottom, the majority, and then three of us at the top. State, church, you know, and whoever is like in the prime sort of leadership role. That's it. You know, when It's all of us holding up that pyramidical structure of capitalism here at the bottom. Can we wake up? Can we galvanize? And I think it's really important that we reference what is happening right now in the global moment of COVID-19 pandemic, that I do not think it is a wrong or incorrect or inaccurate narrative to say that the moneyed class has no problem whatsoever opening the economy back up when it's the lives of the workforce of the proletariat classes that are at stake. And then when we again put this into the context, and the data's there in the UK as well, I shared that very, very poignant article, that the data's there, that it's disproportionately affecting communities of color.
Absolutely.
So when are we going to decide that we actually have to do the privilege unpacking, as uncomfortable as that is, that we need to explore our personal construct of intersectionality, our collective construct of intersectionality? We need to do it in action. So this work of unpacking your privilege, and the work of anti-racism is to say it's a very simple dualistic structure at work.
Yeah.
And the hierarchy is oppressing us all. Yeah. So that is why the scholar who is forwarding the an anti-racism platform at the moment, a very important work came out last year, perhaps, Ibrahim X. Kendi, wrote his treatise all about anti-racism. It's on my shelf just right here. It's a very simple book, and it's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he just hammers chapter after chapter after chapter. That's like, you're either racist or anti-racist. There's no in between.
Yeah.
But because you experience the privilege of your privileges, you will not readily give up your privileges. You will not readily relinquish them, because then that will add to your suffering. Yeah. And let us remember that until and unless we transcend the programming of suffering, you will always default, you human will always default to your lowest human programming, which is survival. Yeah. And for me, that brings us right back to yoga.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Tantra. What is the initial stage of practice? What is this about? One of the early organizations of Tantra was in 8 chapters, okay? And the first chapter of Tantra was called Paschachara Tantra. I mean, it still is. It's not a was, okay? So the first, when you're talking about Tantra in terms of the 8 chapters of the Tantras, the first one is called Paschachara Tantra, the taming of the animal nature, right? Or Kriya Yoga, okay?
Yeah.
Not the Kriya Yoga that's trademarked. Hatha Yoga as Kriya, culminating in Laya Samadhi, because some of you are technicians and you will understand a little bit more what I'm referencing, right? And so that's, or hang on, I got one more for you Vajrayanis out there, your preliminary practices. Wait, the Tibetan word was in my head and it went back out, but it's going to come back in. Okay, so your Lundros. What most Vajrayani practitioners are given by their lamas is only preparatory practices. But you will be made to think that you are being given the highest of the highest initiations and the highest of the highest things, and all they have you doing is one form of preparatory practice after another. And you're not even getting into the yoga stage. You're not even getting into the union wisdom stage of practice. It's another trickery that's done by these teachers to make you think that you're doing something. Okay, Kriya, Laya Samadhi, these are brilliant practices that can improve our health, our well-being, our mental strength. Not to say that if you just practice those in a lifetime, that that's not enough. But what's not cool is when your dedication as a practitioner is exploited with you thinking that you're progressing, that you're dedicated in this thing. I'm moving to the syllabus of practices, and you're basically just being given the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, right? So while we need to prepare ourselves, while we need to be ready and prepared, this vessel, this body for practice, it's like these systems at every single turn are exploiting this body. Is that making any sense, Emma?
That actually within the organizations that there is a disempowerment of the student through their dedication, so that people don't even know that they're not actually accessing the real practices as a kind of like, yeah. And yet people are held with this sense that you can somehow advance, that you can somehow acquire the power, that if you do as you're told, actually eventually you'll get there.
Right, which may keep you even longer in an abusive setting, a setting that's no longer serving you, an abusive organization, an organization that's financially mismanaging itself, or committing social ills, or is having problematic political associations. There are so many avenues of exploitation, right? Yeah. So this kind of area of the discussion we're in, it's getting a little wavy. It's getting a little, kind of like, wait, where are we? Yeah, because we're in multiple places at the same time. And this work, this dismantling work, this unpacking work, looking at these dualities, yoga's the very tool to look at this. What is Advaita Vedanta for if it's not for galvanized social justice, right? To understand dualistic structures. But I can tell you, as someone who has sat a lot with very high masters of Advaita Vedanta, because my guru was like, Yoli, stop avoiding using your brain. Go study with so-and-so and understand Advaita Vedanta. And I'm sitting there like, blink, blink, are you kidding? Like, one more time, we're going to talk about this witness consciousness. Me, I want to be out there training my body and serving the people, lady of action. I got 8 arms and I'm riding a tiger, The tiger's over there snoring, bored, So, no disrespect meant to any lineages of Advaita Vedanta. Just saying, it's not exactly my cup of tea, right? But with that said, the science of understanding the subjective, how the subjective mind creates the dualities, how you get off the hamster wheel, how we dismantle structures of dualities, I say there's the fodder for social justice. That's how we take these teachings and we get back into action. Yeah. Right? It's no longer about navel gazing.
No, my sense is that even, the practice that kind of nourishes and keeps this particular show on the road with Yoga Nidra is a practice that if you're deep in connected with Yoga Nidra, you can't but feel that this is calling for action for social justice. Because apart from anything else, it's needed to redress people's levels of exhaustion and depletion. And so you see that a lot of people are motivated by the fact that the practices make them feel good and well and healing and powerful. And so everybody deserves access to them. And that's one kind of motivation that people in yoga have, this kind of, and that gets kind of misdirected sometimes. It's like, well, that you're going to kind of go and save the world by teaching yoga in the way that you learned it. But actually what you sense is that the very practices themselves are so powerful and so valuable that we can't leave them in the hands of the exploiters. We don't want to leave them there, because the very kind of toxic, harmful situations in which many people learn these practices they need to crumble. Once we call out the harms that are there, then the practices themselves are liberated, and we can actually make use of them in the ways that are needed in unique, specific communities. And I feel that in lots of ways, a huge privilege that I've had as in part of my working life is to travel. And I mean, I'm really seeing that now, and no one can travel anywhere. We're all held in. But I feel that the privilege of having actually like heart-based connections with people I've seen all over the world, actually engaging with the liberation, inspiration that they've had from their own practices, and offering that out to their communities in the specific ways that are needed. And that seems to me hugely, it's like a really deep democracy that has to completely, it can't thrive if everything has to be centralized and held by these organizations. They have to come apart. I see the grassroots thing, the work that's happening. What you need to do with Yoga Nidra in the grief circles in Chicago is going to be different from what needs to happen in Belfast or in Indonesia or out in Thailand, where people are working with kids who've been, trafficked by the sex trade. Like everybody needs different and specific applications of the yoga, and the people best placed to do that are the people within each community. And that's what I've had the privilege of seeing, people from all over the world, people working with the doulas in the Middle East, and actually sharing supportive, empowering birth practices through yoga for women there, and all these, people working with Syrian refugees in Gloucestershire. And these are all specific examples that I feel a huge privilege of having actually seen the uplifting reality of what happens when magnificent, usually women, I have to say, magnificent women get hold of their yoga practices and feel in their hearts how important it is not to leave them in these oppressive systems of abusers and bystanders and beneficiaries, and to free them up for everybody to be able to access. Because the current situation we have is not very accessible. It's elitist and racist and completely judgmental about all sorts of other things that are really, really harmful. And it's not a fit place to leave the yoga. That's what I feel.
We got a lot of dismantling work to do, and Mother Nature herself is supporting us in this work. This is, it's happening. And this isn't a one-time deal. This isn't just like, oh, we're in this phase and then like COVID's going to pass and then we're going to go back. No. We're not going back anywhere. It is through. So I have one more key point that I wanted to make sure that I shared this evening. And that is something that is, I had a discussion after we posted the video on Tantric Gurukul, and today's discussion for me is very much, bringing together, these three, discussions that we've had, that, and this is a very important part of our intersectionality framework, that I personally am holding space for the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine to come back together. And I'm seeing in many, many, many sacred feminine spaces an alienation of the sacred masculine simply by it not even being recognized. Now, I pause here and note that I am talking in a binary way. The way that I have learned that Tantras includes both binary and non-binary constructs. And we did a whole course here just to explore the embodiment of gender and how that is expressed in the Tantras, like literally from the evolutionary steps of going from nothing the grand nothingness, the grand voidness, all the way to creation, we were like, let's dig in here. Like, what can we find in iconography? What can we find in text? What can we find in, like, how can we unpack this and tap back into it? And then, like, what is in this body? What is the wisdom house, this body, always bringing this back to the body, and beyond just a level of gender identification and or sexual orientation and or the presence of which types of genitalia you're born with, so on and so forth. Okay, so for me, like, I really do subscribe to gender as a spectrum. The tantras that I learned, the indigenous practices that I learned, both of the main lineages work with gender as a spectrum. I'm just going to step into a little binary moment here.
Okay, we got it.
And that being that there has to be space in Yoni Shakti, the movement, for men, not as simply just allies, not just simply as pushed out into the margin because what we're doing is centering women and the female experience. I think that is a stage of unpacking privilege and getting into the dynamic system of intersectionality. I don't think that's our stopping point. I believe the greater and larger work right now, and it's happening now and into the future, is for the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine to be able to return to the council fire together and work together. And so when we spoke in the Tantric Gurukul discussion, and we right from the start centered the tantras in a paradigm of matriarchal and matrilineal. Yeah. And we said, but the teachings weren't only for women.
Yeah.
This is what I'm talking about, that this is also an issue of intersectionality, and that we have to struggle a little because we might not know the way. We might not know how to do this, which means we might muck it up at times. And that's okay. And this is also a message about anti-racism work, unpacking privilege work, social justice work. The goal is not to get it perfect or to get it right, but it's to call it out and in at the same time, to make a commitment to seeing it through within yourself, within the systems, to shine the spotlight onto it and expose it from the dark corner where it's been hiding.
Yeah.
And to call it into the light, right? That it can be healed. We have a healing to do of sacred masculine and sacred feminine. And right now, similar to social justice movements of all sorts, what we will see is women gathering in women's spaces, men gathering in men's spaces, people of color gathering people of color spaces, and then that gets real specific as well. Queer gathering in queer spaces, and I want you all to understand that is okay. That is part of the process. That is actually a very significant part of the process. And in that vein, I would like to propose that we have affinity spaces, dedicated spaces in the Yoni Shakti movement, in this emerging movement, for groups that identify similarly to gather, so that your shared experiences can be validated, can be heard, wherein you don't have to walk into a community space knowing, if I talk about my experience as a Black, brown woman, of color, that I am going to be challenged. I'm going to be challenged by white fragility, white tears, and white guilt. And I'm going to then have my trauma triggered all over again, when actually what I need to do is be able to get fortified by being in, for example, a dedicated POC only space, people of color space, and then I can come in and I can just really let down, you know, my guard, and be able to just know that these people, because their experience is so strikingly similar, they're just going to be able to really resonate. And I believe with honoring the spaces of affinity, that we will be able to come back into, from those small circles to little medium circles, and then those medium circles will grow into larger circles. I believe we will be able to come back into large circle when it's not harmful for the most marginalized people. So, you know, I had my experience hanging out, you know, in the festivals with you guys in the summer last year, you know, and I'm walking around Buddha Field, and I see the men's space, and I looked at it so longingly. They had all these cool, like, warrior pictures out on their tent, and like just cool vibe, this and that. And I'm like, I love that vibe, because I am super in touch with my sacred masculinity, and he's cool. You know, I identify as she, her, hers. Like, those are my pronouns. I don't see myself as being other than a woman in my gender construct, but I love my inner Shiva, and I'm really in touch with him, and I respect his medicine just in the same amount of self-love as I respect my Shakti. So I wanted to make sure that you know, we call that in, that we're not going to get this right. We're going to fumble it. We're going to bumble it. People might get harmed. People might get hurt. But so long we approach this dismantling work with the ethic of seeing it through.
Yeah.
With the group agreements, with you know, accountability, we're going to find our way. But if we don't set up these parameters from the start, you're going to blink and it's only going to be a room full of affluent white women.
Yeah. And I would really like to hold this image and reality of how we move forward, so that we move in a way that actually makes it possible for there to be real change. Because unless we're actually listening and learning from each other, and I feel the power of those affinity groups. I see sometimes they're really, really specific. It's women who had very particular experiences around menarche. You know, there's certain specific experiences, and you need to gather and be with those experiences in order for them to be, you know, something that can be processed and clear, and that their support is required to do that. I also see that unless we're actually aware of what happens if we don't in. And what's happened in the past is that actually you can see it happening within yoga circles, where actually the kind of level of exclusivity and exclusion, it is just, nobody even questions it, you know. And I think we're calling in questioning, because what we can see is that the harms that have been caused by the structures that we've been, you know, learning within and part of for so long are just no longer, it's no longer acceptable now that we can see what's going on.
Outdated.
So it's outdated. And so my call for going forward is this. I love this, where actually mistakes can be made, and with the intention, the shared intention to actually see through change, what we have is a strategy that's kind of emerging from those people who are willing to work together in that field. You know, if we're willing to work together in that field to have actual real change, then we have to use different structures of leadership, different structures of decision making, different kinds of ways of holding groups, which will include and there are technologies for doing this even within a virtual group, where we can have little specific group messenger groups and specific tags and specific topics, and actually those in their multiplicity, that actually we can thrive. But that, it doesn't mean that it's not like the kind of leadership I was working in campaigning and activism as a student, as a young adult, and it was always like, this was the way, the truth, and the light. There would be the person at the front who was telling you what to do, and everybody just followed along that. We can't do that anymore. And so what I perceive as we step forward in this is a modeling of the kind of strategies that emerge out of the needs of the people who are willing to do the work, which will include what you're describing, and that actually, I'm not even sure we know quite how to do it, because it hasn't been done before.
We don't.
What we're doing is taking things apart. So we have to be prepared to have conversations like this with each other, to listen and learn. That's why when I started thinking, who's here in this Yoni Shakti, the movement? Yeah, we have the survivors. Yeah, we have the allies. We have the whistleblowers. We have the people who are actually standing there in support of what's happened and who desire change. And then people who have been totally outcast from those organizations and excluded from them. And everybody's been harmed in different ways. So we need to address the real damage that's arisen, and then actually take it apart. We don't quite know.
Yeah, and
how to do that. But
who's
I feel
not here. We
Yeah.
see who's visible, who's not visible. We need to go through basically a critical analysis process of perspective taking and assessing for bias. And that begins with oneself.
Yeah. So, and what better tools than yoga to do that? Do you see what I mean? This is why I have great hope. I have great sense. It's not even hope. I actually feel that within all of the different, activities that humans get up to. I mean, and humans do all kinds of things. It's like these humans in this group have chosen to do yoga, to do this practice of yoga. And if these are the humans that have chosen this liberation tool, then of all the humans that there are, these are the humans who can actually figure out a way to take apart the structures that have constrained and imprisoned the liberation practices that have liberated them anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, we do those liberation practices in those oppressive structures and become in some little way freer than we were to begin with, so we can see what's not free. So I really feel that the energy of the practices that we do, the energy of the connection of the people, the sanghas and the community is so powerful and vibrant that we can, however messy it is, move forward. So and also part of this is that we need to rest. So I think, Yoli, we should probably
start. Yeah, we're gonna finish up here. This was good. I'm feeling, this was kind of the toughest one of them all, because this is the one we know the least about, but it's so important that we call in.
Yeah.
It's so important that we honor impact over intention. It's really important that we get back to core of this social justice, healing justice work.
Yeah.
And we liberate the liberation tool of yoga, because yes, what ultimately is the problem here is constructs of identity. Yes, and so that's pretty advanced work. Right now, let's talk about quality of life for all beings. Right? Let's talk about food, clothing, shelter, water, air for our children and our grandchildren. Let's talk about, equitable distribution of resources. Let's talk about the colonization of the female body as representation of the colonization of the ecosystem of the earth.
Yeah.
Let's use the practices that we have. And so what we're going to do now is dream.
Yeah. We're going to dream.
We're going to go into the rest and repair space.
Yeah. And we invite you to do the same.
And we're gonna science fiction write. We're going to be Afrofuturists. And we're going to make art. And we're going to be so radical in our self-care. Right? Yeah. And this is the radical doing of this moment right now.
Yeah. So take good care of yourselves.
I will.
take good care of yourselves, and we have the tools here of deep and powerful liberation, and everybody deserves to get a hold of them. So that's the intention, to get those tools out there. And in order to do that, I'm required to say thank you to Yoli for her
Thank you, Ma.
engagement. What a good conversation. Thank you, love. And also to make sure that if you didn't get the message at the beginning, that you get it at the end, that you visit YoniShaktiTheMovement.com. YoniShaktiTheMovement.com, and please share and maybe back the campaign, or share it with people who might like to do that. And I'll be seeing you again over the next week with upliftment and inspiration from magnificent people who are doing this work. It's already happening. We just need to join up the dots, and that way we see how it is that people are already working to reclaim yoga for the rightful place that it deserves as a tool for freedom and justice and healing. So sleep is the key for healing. We're going to go do that now. Dream well. Yoli Ma, thank you so much for all that you've done.
Always
Generous, deep love and respect. With great respect and love.
We froze right at the end, huh?
On my heart, I want a cloud recording. Yes.